Welcome to the Wild Physio podcast with your host, Andrew Wild. Today, I welcome Nick Flood, who has been working as a physio for over 11 years and has 4 ski seasons of experience working in Japan at Nozawa and Nisakawa. Is that how you say it?
Niseko, yeah, close enough.
I always get it wrong, that. Physio. That's where he's been working. His favorite joint to treat is the knee. Due to the sheer amount of these injuries he has seen on the slopes. A huge welcome to Nick Flood. How are you, mate?
Good, mate. Thanks for having me. It's been about 8 or 9 months delayed, but we finally got here, I guess.
We did. I actually met Nick last year. Well, maybe it was early this year. It was over the New Year period when I was actually in Nozawa Onsen skiing, and I dropped into the clinic there, and you were working, and we had a chat, and then ran into each other as well later in the week. And I thought you were a perfect person to get on the podcast because it is a route that some physios out there want to go down and work overseas and work on the slopes, but I was kind of intrigued how you got into it. And that kind of segues into the first question. How did you start working over in Japan? Because it's a really interesting way to go in terms of career development and your trajectory.
Yeah, I would have started. I'd worked for a few years in a private practice in the eastern suburbs of Adelaide. It's a very kind of sporty based clinic, and a colleague of mine there he'd just come back from Japan, and essentially the circumstances had been they needed a last minute manager to run the clinic. He had somehow weaseled his way into the door, and he'd helped kind of manage the clinic for a little bit, and then he'd come back to Adelaide after finishing his masters, and he said, if you want to do something different, this is an option. And I think naively, being 1 or 2 years out of physio, I thought, oh, once you start working, that's it. It's 10 years in one job, and I get a few weeks a year for holidays, and that's it. And so when he had mentioned it, I thought, right, that'd be good. I'll get some experience, and I essentially just threw my hat in the ring with an owner who has a bunch of clinics over in Japan, and so happened to be that a spot had opened up after I'd been traveling around for a few months, and got on a Skype call and had an interview. And a few months later, he'd said, "Oh, well, there's a spot that's just opened up. Do you want to come and have a crack?" So I had my first season in Niseko, and then the following seasons after that, I'd relocated down to Nozawa Onsen, where I met you, and had been there for the last 3 seasons. So I started back in about 2016, it would have been. Worked for a few seasons, had a few years off with COVID and everything as well, and then came back this year and was running the clinic down in Nozawa. So that's the origin story.
When you're working in Nozawa, do you live in Nozawa as well, in the little village?
Yep, yeah. So for people that haven't been there, it's quite a
Mm.
charming village. You've got 13, 14 free onsens, these hot kind of baths that range from pretty tepid to alarmingly scaldingly hot, and you go in there, and it's a great little recovery, and also a bit of a preparation for the day's skiing and snowboarding. But you live in town, and we've had various accommodations over the years, but we would usually live there. It's all walking distance, so you'd walk down to the clinic. The clinic's open from 8 to 8. We have kind of two different shifts there, an 8 till 2 and a 2 to 8. And it's a really nice feeling in town. You've got a few people that have businesses there that are coming back every year and live there, and then you have all the locals. And the unique thing about Nozawa is that they've got the locals own the mountain. So there's a little kind of committee that keeps it quite Japanese, and controls the amount of businesses and things there, which is quite nice because you don't have all these big companies coming in and changing changing the feel of the place, I guess. So some of these other mountains are owned by the big groups that have resorts throughout America and other places. So Nozawa is quite a charming village, very really easy to get around, some nice food, and some really good snow if you know where to go. So
Yeah, it's amazing. I absolutely loved it. And I'm coming back, actually, not that you'll be there by the sounds of it. You said most likely not be over there, but I'm going back next February, so looking forward to it. So it sounds like to me the process was pretty easy, other than obviously putting your name down, getting through the interview process. In terms of getting registration and these type of things over in Japan, is that something you have to chase?
It's an interesting one because physio in Japan is quite different to physio in Australia. So registration isn't much an issue really. So you can practice over there. We're covered, like you've got indemnity insurance and everything anyway. But it's not like going to Canada or America and having to prove a competency almost. So their kind of hierarchy of jobs in Japan is the doctors are right up the top. And physio is probably a different style of physio. It's very, very directed. There probably isn't as much autonomy that you would get in physio and in sports physio, where you're getting to make all these decisions on people's or offering advice on what you think these players and athletes can do. So it's a different registration process there, and that side of things is quite easy. Um, Typically, most people will get a working holiday visa, and that would cover them for pretty much 2 seasons. And then after that, you're having to pretty much be sponsored to come back. So I was sponsored this last season, and you're essentially on a different visa, and that allows you to come back and to work over there legally. So
Is that sponsored by the business or sponsored by
yes,
someone else? Yep.
yeah, sponsored by the business. So
Yeah.
Bevan Colles, who's had the clinics over in Japan for, I think, coming up close to 20 years. He would have started in Niseko and then has one in Tokyo, and I think he's mainly based in Singapore these days. But Miyoko, Hakuba, all over Japan. So the business sponsored you, and typically they like to have a manager coming back because it's a more fluent from season to season experience, I guess. But sometimes what happens is you might work for a year as a physio, and then maybe you try your hand at managing, and then maybe that person moves on, and you kind of will get the next person in line. So it's registration wise, I'd say in summary, isn't a difficult thing. But the visa and probably just getting a position is more the challenging thing. So
Yeah.
a lot of physios will do kind of split shifts where they're doing physio and massage when they first come on. So if you're experienced and you've done a bunch before and you've been with the company before, it's obviously just all physio. But if you're wanting to kind of start entry level with it, it can often be this kind of massage, reception, a bit of physio to kind of make sure that other physios get a day off. But otherwise, it's a 6 day a week for between 3 and 5 months work, and it's a great country to be. It's uniquely itself, Japan. It's not really like anywhere else I've been before, so it's definitely unique, and it's a great place to spend a few months, and world class snow as well. I mean, it's the Japanese powder is it's its own little unique thing, and even comparing the North Island to the main island, it's very, very different snow, I guess, especially compared to Australia, where it's a very different level of snow.
Yeah, it's hard to go back to Australian snow when you've been in Japan.
Yeah.
Now, so does that mean the clinic closes down over the summer months?
So most of the clinics will. They turn into a bit more of, like most ski resorts, will turn into kind of mountain biking and hiking. There just isn't enough traffic to keep in Nozawa open. Niseko has a bit of a skeleton crew. So there's the manager that was there this season. She lives there with her family, and she's there for the off season. So, but it's definitely wouldn't be the same like intensity that happens in the ski season. It's kind of from December till March. It's a quite like a busy period, and resorts change from from one to another. But it makes for some like pretty intense shifts where you're seeing some pretty big injuries as well. So, which is probably one of the best things about it, which might sound bad, but the exposure to certain types of injuries that you just wouldn't see in that number. In I'm not sure in any other setting in the world. Maybe for the Olympic clinic, you would see you'd see more ACLs, but it's amazing how many acute ones that you're seeing there and giving your opinion on.
Speaking of, what does a day look like for you when you are on the slopes? And no doubt some days are busier than others, depending on the weather as well. Because if the weather's terrible, obviously people aren't going out skiing and snowboarding and injuring themselves. But how does a day typically look? And if you're doing those split shifts, does it mean you're getting out on the slopes yourself?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've found as well is you become a bit of a snow snob as well. For if you're there for X amount of months, I'd be a little more picky about when I go out. So afternoons are pretty much off. It's all morning riding and on days off riding. So if I had a 2 to 8 shifts, I would be up usually get relatively early, maybe like 6 or so, go to an onsen, try and warm up the joints a little bit. As I was telling you before, I'm due for some operations, so I need all the warming up I can get, and then would go out for first lift. So you'd go up and you put your board in line and you'd wait at the gondola, and I would usually ride for maybe a few hours and be done at maybe 11, maybe 12 at the latest. Come back, onsen, have some lunch, and then head into work. And that'd be a typical day. Warren, I'd say this year I was doing a bit more kind of the management side of things than riding. So I'm probably getting out 2 or maybe 3 times max a week, but more likely just once or twice. Whereas previous years, I would be probably 3 or 4 times a week. So you have ample time to ride and to ski if you want to, and you can go every single day. But by the afternoons, I tend to kind of steer clear and kind of prefer to get the early stuff really. So you get a little bit of a snobbery to it when you're so spoiled.
You want fresh tracks.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's completely fair enough. I actually ran into you that time when you were coming back from, I think you'd gone out in the morning and you were working that afternoon. You just had a good morning out. It was a bluebird,
Yeah.
cracking day.
It's some of the depending on the time of year that you come, I think in December it can be a little bit sometimes hit or miss at some of the resorts. But um, funnily enough, in March when we'd lost a bunch of the base of snow, we had the best days riding in middle of March when there was no one there. So it's sometimes hard to predict. And my first season, I think there might be a bit of mayonnaise on this, but they said it was their worst year in 40 years, and it was still 9 odd meters of snow. So the Japanese bad and the Australian bad is two very different things. Having said that, this season was a little bit down on snow, but um, having said that, some of the days where it's just I'm relatively tall and shoulder deep powder, it's pretty hard to beat. So
Yeah, there was one night we got 90 centimeters when we were there, and I'd never seen that amount of snow in one night, and it was just insane. The amount of snow on top of the cars, let alone up on the mountain, it was just incredible, and it was so much fun.
it's
Now, and
always it's always a good sign when you wake up and you look out and you see that layer on top
yeah,
of all the little K cars, and
yeah,
it's going to be it's a pretty good start to the day. And I think one of the things I enjoy the most is when you come down from riding and you're heading into the clinic and you've had a bunch of good turns and you've hit some good spots, and it's a pretty good way to start your day. So I think some of those times that I saw you might have been a bluebird after some snow, and then I think we might have actually gone pretty quiet in terms of snowfall for a lot of January. So there was a lot of, probably a little bit disappointed people that had come expecting something. And I think the season or two before was maybe 2 seasons before was a very, very good one. So it is a bit of a roll of the dice, but certain times of year, your Januaries and Februaries in particular tend to be pretty safe bets.
And this will probably depress some of the people that went up to Perisher or Thredbo from Sydney to go skiing or snowboarding this season. How much is a season pass at Nazao Onsen?
Oh, I think from memory, maybe 600 or 700. I think maybe.
You know how
I
much it is
reckon,
now at Perisher and Thredbo? It's like close to $230, $40 per day if you book it on the day. Obviously, you can get the season pass and it's cheaper, but still, if you're buying it on the day, that's just ridiculous. Because Nazao, when I was there, I think it was $68 a day or something like that.
yeah, yeah, and it used to be a lot cheaper than that as well. So that sounds expensive to me. And they also have various different kind of tickets you can get, opposed to just the full day one. There's a couple of hours and some other little deals that they've got. But overall, I mean, what you're paying for is great snow and quite a good experience, I guess, compared to, not that I'm sitting here trying to rag on Australian ski fields, but you get some great food and
You don't
some,
need a rag on them because it's obvious. Like
yeah,
you go to an overseas ski field and you know immediately that the snow in Australia just doesn't cut it comparatively,
yeah.
does it?
No, well, yeah, it definitely ruins domestic trips for you. So it
Yeah.
becomes, yeah. And having said that, pre-COVID as well, it was pretty cheap to have a holiday in Japan. You would have you get flights and the accommodation wasn't expensive. The lift passes weren't expensive, and you can do the same amount with that money than going to a Victorian or New South Wales ski field. So it's yeah, it's very uh, yeah, it's a very appealing thing. A little bit more expensive now, but depending on where you're going, it's still very, quite affordable, I'd say.
Yeah, I had an amazing time. Nazao was very unique, and I like the
Yeah.
fact that it's not sort of overly westernized. It was great. Highly recommend it. But please don't every Australian now go to Nazao because when I'm there in February, I don't want it to be too packed.
You want other people to enjoy it, but at the same time, almost don't want to tell too many people about it because it has gotten busier over, since 2016, 17. But working in, say the North Island up in Hokkaido, you definitely get an appreciation for like a bit of a quieter village and skiing experience. And I guess the thing that Nozawa is known for is the tree runs, and probably Japan in general is a lot of the side country. And although they don't have the verticals that are like a European resort or American resort would have, they've got some incredibly deep powder, and it's a hard feeling to beat when you've just got that floating feeling when you're snowboarding down through a few trees and try not to bump into them. So yeah, it's a very unique experience, but highly recommend. But not too many people go there.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Now, in terms of the type of injuries you get when you are working on the slopes, the type of injuries that you get that walk in the door, that just come off the slopes, what are you typically seeing?
So I think when you look at some of the research, it's pretty consistent with that. I'd say most of our injuries with skiing and knees. They tend to be predominantly ACL injuries. MCL would be a close second. Um, and then if we had a look at snowboarding, majority are going to be wrist fractures, so distal radius fractures. So that'd be the most common ones for each. Interesting enough, when you look at the research, like calf injuries don't get much of a mention with skiing. So gastrocs tears a lot of the time, kind of high grade tears, when the nose of the skis will kind of dig into the powder. You go over the top, have an extension kind of movement at the knee. They get the pop, and funnily enough, those guys can come in without walking, but they can actually get out in the skis because you're in that squatted position. Soleus takes on a bit more of the load, and they might not be able to calf raise or walk too well, but they can um, sometimes get out on some skis not too long afterwards. But there's obviously some considerations with that, with flying back home, and is it really worth it, and the risk of re-injuring and things like that. So, but majority would be knee injuries for skiing and a lot of wrists for the snowboarders.
Yeah, and according to one study, it did mention around with skiing, it was the knee was 31.2%, shoulder 21%, and then in terms of the total injuries, and then snowboarding was, yeah, 23.9% were hand and wrist. So, and then ACLs was ended up being the injury proportion of ACLs was 14.9 in skiing.
Yeah.
So, so in terms of the mechanism with an ACL with skiing, what is the classic mechanism that you find that you'd see in the slopes?
So there's probably about 4 or 5 that have been described in the literature. Now, a lot of them will relate a bit more to kind of alpine and decline, sorry, like downhill skiing. So the classic one that we would see would be the kind of like the phantom boot, or what would happen is you'd be coming down, you'd lose control, you tend to kind of lean back, and the instructors will often tell keep yourself arms forward, not back, and you lean back, your hips get below your knees. The uphill ski hand will reach up the mountain. The uphill ski will then be there'll be no kind of like contact with your edge, and then what will happen is the downhill ski will catch an inside edge, and it kind of like zips you off, and you'll get quite a big valgus internal rotation force at the knee, and that can be all from coming off a chairlift to losing control of the turn. And if you had to contrast that to some of the other mechanisms, which would be a bit more the big jump and the downhill skiing, it's the kind of slip catch where the downhill ski will slip out and then will catch that inside edge, and once that inside edge is there, it can buckle the knee inwards. Or likewise, you can get the dynamic snowplow, they'll call it, which is the inside, the uphill ski will also get this slip catch mechanism on the outside downhill ski, and then you roll from an outside edge to an inside edge, and then we get this kind of crossover of the skis, and you get that internal rotation force as well. So interestingly enough, they'll end up in a similar force going through the knee. And the unique thing about skiing is, depending on what your DINs are set to and how easy those skis will pop off, if you're a really experienced, aggressive skier, you want the settings so you don't just do a turn and they pop off straight away.
And just with that, in terms of those numbers around the DINs, is there something that we need to be aware of if you are a skier? Like, what should we be setting it to, or is this based around previous history of injury and like how heavy someone is? How do you go about figuring that out?
Yeah, it's typically there's a few variables, like the experience is a big one. When they're usually setting up at the rental shops and things like that, like the guys are typically pretty good. Like they'll get your weights, they'll kind of figure out your experience. One thing though is people tend to self-report how good they are, I'd say, like not only when they'd go to a rental shop, but when they come into the clinic. So you tend to see people probably overstating how good they are, but that number needs to be like adjusted to the person. That there's no point in having a really beginner level skier that every time they go to turn, the DINs is so kind of like cranked up that it's never going to pop off, because they're just more likely to fall and be exposed to these pretty unique positions and forces through the knee. So they need their own setting, and really the technicians tend to be pretty good at figuring that out.
Right. Now, with the snowboarding injuries, you can get ACL injuries with a snowboarding injury. How do they typically do it with that? Because this is a question I often get in clinic.
So really, some of the research will be that it's mostly the border cross guys. Now it's typically a front leg. It's usually knuckling a jump, overshooting a jump and landing on the flat. But clinically, what I would see is it tends to be more hitting trees. So the tree and a valgus force to the outside of the knee. I think in 4 seasons so far, I haven't seen too many that have been from uh, big air jumps. There can be some hyperflexion and a bit of rotation that happens when they get really kind of tangled up, but it's far less likely as a snowboarder to do your ACL than skiing. I mean, your feet are planted in. They can only kind of really go so far, and typically it tends to be hitting a tree or contact with someone else that comes into the side of their knee, and it'll be that contact valgus force that gets it. You don't see as many when they're kind of skating along and scooting with their front foot into the bindings. That doesn't happen as much, but it also gives people a fair bit more confidence that if they're going back or they're coming back from an ACL injury, snowboarding is a inherently safer um, activity than skiing, I guess. So a lot of people are pretty reassured to know that, if I go on this and I've maybe they've got a brace on, maybe they don't, but there's just not as much force that can get through that knee in that fashion compared to say the skiing injury.
Yeah, it's interesting that study I sent you about the snowboard cross athletes, and up to 50% of them had torn their ACL at some point in their career, which was fascinating. I didn't expect it to be that high. And 31% suffered more than one ACL tear during their career. And 91% of them, of the ACL ruptures, were their front leg.
Mm.
So their right leg if they're goofy and left if they're natural. Is that right?
Yep.
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 Really interesting the fact that that would happen. I suppose it's more of a like there's a lot more bodies in that area, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's a lot more going on and a lot more risk of injury with that just because of the amount of people, because that's the one where they go down together, isn't it? It's like a race. Is that
Yeah,
right?
it's a race with jumps and multiple other people around, and it's a very, once again, quite a unique sport. But you're not only contesting with knuckling jumps or getting edged out a little bit, not having enough speed, landing on the flat or overshooting something because you're
Mm,
trying to just overtake someone. So it has its own unique variables to that, but also just contact from other people and trying
yeah.
to get into, trying to win a race essentially.
Mm,
So we probably don't see that as much in Japan, really, but it'd be mostly the tree riding is what a lot of people are coming to Japan to do. And the unfortunate thing about some of these Japanese trees is, although they're not as thick as some of like the European counterparts, they don't move. They don't really budge too well. So not many people win one-on-ones with them. And it tends to be, if you've got a bit of a root kind of sticking out, or another probably common one that people get is when there's just enough snow to cover some roots or some branches, and you come underneath that and the board just stops and they keep going, and it's just a force that goes through your knee that is, it's once again very unique, but that will just do a big multi-ligament injury usually to the knee. And yeah, you can see some pretty nasty stuff with those. So I'd say trees and getting your board underneath something that's just been freshly covered with snow.
think a lot of people are a little bit terrified of doing their ACL when they are skiing or snowboarding. Have you got any tips and tricks for us out there to reduce our risk of injury when we do go skiing or snowboarding?
Yeah, that was probably all doom and gloom there. It's not. There's a lot of people that ski and snowboard and don't hurt themselves. So I guess it's just the people that I see. So look, I've written myself off from skiing. Again, I used to ski and then I took up snowboarding. But I think that the main thing is the conditioning coming into the trip. These ski holidays in particular are pretty interesting with the psychology of it all. If I was to say you're going to do multiple hours of touch footy 5 days in a row that you haven't done for 12 months, you'd say that doesn't seem like a very smart idea. But when we go on a holiday, we think, oh, that those same principles don't apply. There's almost this cognitive dissonance of, I don't need to apply the same principles to an equally dangerous sport. So The main thing I'd say is like conditioning. So, with both sports, strong quads, you want, especially skiing, like hip knee control, super important. I think a lot of people, if they're coming from a job where they work 40, 50 hours sitting down a week and go for a bike ride on a weekend, it's not quite the same as getting to an afternoon on day 4 and going down a Mowgli run and the legs are completely gone. It's you're more likely just to get hurt that way. So I'd say the main thing is like a good block for 3 months beforehand really should be a minimum. Now, in reality, it's not what happens. But it is very different forces compared to what you do with other sports. And I'm a big fan of getting your long hold squats and getting some weight on the legs and getting just like legs of steel, because I mean if your legs can just help out a little bit there, and you're not having to, especially with snowboarding, once your legs are done, you tend to start throwing yourself around and using your back and these other spots, and then you're more likely just to fall when you're fatigued. So I think coming in with strong legs, and then usually it's good recovery afterwards. We're fortunate in the Zao, we've got free recovery with all the onsens around. But otherwise, also interestingly enough, there tends to be no kind of dynamic warm up or stretches or activation or anything on a ski holiday. It's you wake up and roll out of bed and trundle up the hill and have a coffee, and then straight into 6-7 hours of powder riding. And it's pretty as a snowboarder, powder riding your back leg, you're essentially holding a single leg squat for however long, and you'll get to that point where you're so fatigued, and usually on the ride out of you going down this nice kind of powdery field, and then the ride out is usually a whole bunch of kind of having to navigate through trees. So that's the least opportune time to be fatigued with your legs. So strong legs. The other thing is I'm a big advocate of getting people lessons as well. One, I think people just enjoy it a lot more if you're not as bad. And I think the instructors are pretty good at, rather you figuring it out yourself. They can help fast track it a little bit, and they'll just say, oh, put a bit more weight here, and do this, and if you're riding on the groomers and then you try and do some powder riding, it's a completely different activity, skiing and snowboarding. So I think it's good to have the lessons if you're a beginner. I think some of the stats around wrists and fractures is, if you can make it past the first 4 or 5 days, your chances of fracturing your wrists go down massively. And you'd imagine that's just because you're becoming more competent and you're not as exposed to as many falls. So I would say that's the tips and tricks for not ACL is if you're a beginner skier, strong legs, get some lessons, and also making sure when you're getting set up, you're getting kind of well looked after. If someone just you feel like you're probably not getting a right fit, and it's kind of rush you into some bindings and some skis, it's good to make sure you got someone that's kind of looking out for your best interests, I guess.
Yeah, it's great advice. I think that the big one is the lessons. Because if you just crap at it, obviously there's going to be an increased chance that you're going to fall over and over again, especially with snowboarding. Because I find that a lot of snowboarders, they kind of just like snowflake. Is it called snowflaking when you're going to go back and forth? Is that what it's
Yeah,
called?
for the falling leaf. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, the
yeah.
falling leaf down the black run.
And they're just falling on their back all the time, on their bottom, and they're putting their hand out behind them with that sort of foosh mechanism, or they catch an edge in the front and then they get the foosh at the front.
Yeah, it's snowboarding is one that I think you can make some really good improvements quite quickly, because it is a foreign movement. If you're trying to do a turn, you're kind of leaning forward and leaning downhill, and it's not really not a natural thing. You want to kind of lean back. The problem is when you lean back, you go quicker, and so getting used to this idea of being on the groomers and kind of like rolling into your turns and holding your edges. Um, the instructors are pretty good at getting you doing that, and then once you've got that, you've got the fundamentals. But and then it is a matter of time. But I mean, most people have 5, 6 days, maybe a week. If they're lucky, then they won't do it for 12 months. They'll come back. It's an odd way to retain a skill. So I think having someone just to kind of speed that process up is pretty invaluable. It might cost you a few bucks, but it'll probably also save your relationship. I've seen a fair few spats happening on slopes where someone's down the bottom and someone's halfway up, and it's not a great it's probably not a great feeling in the hotel later on, I wouldn't imagine. But yeah, lots of pretty unhappy people trying to probably teach the other one how to do it. Um, and like with a lot of relationships, if someone else gives you that advice, it can be completely fine. But sometimes it's coming from the person you're with. It's not looked upon as
I feel
as
like as
as the
well,
intentions would be. So
feel like no matter how good you get as well, it's good having a lesson each time you go back as well, just for kind of a tune up
yep.
in a way. I do think that is good advice. And the other thing that I've seen over the years is people kind of around your warm up thing, they go straight to a black run on their first run of the day, rather than, hitting a green or a blue or something like that just to warm up and ease into it a bit. They're just going to go bang straight up to the black run because I suppose because it's first tracks, but still probably not the best way of going about it, just going straight to the hardest run on the mountain.
No, it's once again the psychology around it is quite interesting, and there's the whole saying there's no friends on a powder day and things like that. So people are pretty ruthless with it. If you're waiting in the line and they're running late, it's kind of like green light, see you later. So it's quite ruthless, but yeah, there is a bit of merit to warming up and getting you kind of your touch or your feel right, like just
Yeah.
like you would with any other sport. Um, so it is a unique activity, I guess, that when we compare it to other activities in sports, um, it's got its own little variables and things that need to be addressed. So yeah, and the people that enjoy their holidays generally more, the ones that aren't coming into the clinic, they might be coming for a bit of a massage and a tune-up, but if you put in that work beforehand and you're relatively smart, and I can't tell you the amount of people that they're exhausted and they'll say, oh, one more run, and that's the end of the day and it's 3:30, and it's they're exhausted, and it's just sometimes it's a better call just to call it, and you've had a good day, and the conditions probably aren't too flash either. It's all been chopped up, and um, sometimes knowing when to quit it is a bit of a hard call if you're there for a short amount of time, but it can save people a lot of I guess the alternative, which can be hurting yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Call it a day, get back to the onset and have a beer. I think that's one other thing. Everyone goes on these ski holidays and they often get on the juice a fair bit, and they're having 5 beers a night or something like that, and they're waking up hungover the next day. It's not going to be optimal for performance the next day.
Five beers seems generous, mate. I think some people they go on these holidays, and it's a big night every night. I mean, people,
Mm.
I think, the first day excitements, and the second day and the third days as well. But Japanese alcohol is very cheap as well. It's not taxed the same as in Australia. So um, I think the nice thing about a ski holiday as well, and obviously everyone has different holidays they're going for, but you know, a lot of the time you'll finish skiing, you have some dinner, and it's about 6:30 or 7 o'clock, and you're ready to go to bed if you've had a big day. So that side of recovery is really good, but sometimes getting on the chew highs and the beers afterwards, people come into the next day, and it's I guess you wouldn't do it with any other activity, but maybe Resi's footy you would, but it's yeah it it's once the thing, it's not the most ideal, not the ideal recovery, I wouldn't say.
Well, the example you gave of playing 5 days of touch football in a row and you haven't played all year, that's a really good way to frame it. It's we see it a lot at the clinic, just before the either the Northern Hemisphere season or the Australian season, people come in 6 weeks before they're off to their skiing holiday and they're like, get me fit. Well, probably should have started about 4 months ago, but
Yeah.
anyway, anything is better than nothing, but at the same time, like you need a plan for these things and think about, all right, when do I really need to start thinking about this trip? And like for me in February, not that I've stopped exercising, but for me in February next year, if I was you, if you're going in February, you'd start very soon or now.
Yep.
Now, in regards to the cross bracing protocol, so we've chatted about this in person a little bit. Now, in terms of where you're at with the cross bracing protocol, and because I know that a lot of the skiing mechanisms with the ACL injury are a great candidate often for the cross bracing protocol, what's your experience been with it, your results, where you're at with it at the moment, Nick?
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough to have hours with Dr. Cross at the start of the season, which I think he was probably one of the more in-demand physicians in the country, if not, in the world. And I think he was overseas on a family holiday, and he was chiming in to do like a 3 or 4, 3 hour in service with us, and the correspondence that we had with him even throughout those times was quite impressive. So what we would typically see is, as you said, all the statistics seem to be that the skiers are prime candidates for it. They kind of talk about these low force and high force ACL injuries. Yeah, the classic presentation that you might see is someone in their 30s or 40s, and they're kind of deconditioned like we talked about. The fatigue, they've kind of got their skis crossed over, they've gone back into that kind of that lean back position, and they've kind of felt that pop, and they'll come into the clinic, and the spectrum of injury varies. It still amazes me how much it goes from a isolated ACL to tibial plateau to multi ligament to anything under the sun, and trying to get a good gauge of that can be quite tricky. But in terms of resources we have to make sure that we can potentially give people the option to do that and be, I guess, a candidate for a cross bracing protocol is, we usually try and get that ball rolling and get a bit of a protection phase. Usually it's a non-weight bearing in a brace, like a bit of a dynamic brace that we lock at about 30 to 90 degrees, or usually 40 to 90 degrees. So you're kind of stopping that full extension movement. And if you ask me what I was doing back in 2016, you're trying to get quads going, you're getting VMO firing, you're doing all these things, and the research would say that that's that's putting the ACL in a more elongated position. It's the last thing that you want to be doing. So it has changed, I guess, the understanding of that. But we would usually put people in a brace, get them non-weight bearing. We try and get the ball rolling in terms of talking to Dr. Cross's clinic in the Olympic clinic where he's working, and essentially when they would go back, they would have it lined up that they get the Doppler, they've got the MRI, they have the consult with him. But before that, we talk about the options and conservative surgical, the cross bracing protocol, and it's really got to be well suited to them. So and Tom's very, very good about this. He's not professing that it's the be all and end all and the cure of all ACL injuries. You've got an amount of ACL injuries like this, and it might be that these ones are the ones that are appropriate for, and these are the ones that take it up. So we'll see a lot of these low force injuries, isolated ACLs. Usually there's a concurrent MCL injury as well. The nice thing is those bracing angles seem to help with that as well. And we know that different parts of the MCL, whether you go into terminal extension or past 90 degrees, will stress different aspects of your MCL fibers. So that kind of 30 to 90 tends to cover that as well. There is some talking to the doctors about what we do in terms of kind of clot management flying home. Now, obviously, flying within the first few days after that type of injury, that amount of bleeding, is an elevated risk. And with the clinics have consults. We have a local doctor as well, but we have also like telehealth consults with doctors, and if they need they need blood thinners, or if they need a Clexane injection as they get on the plane, then the travel insurances can be usually pretty helpful with that as well. But usually we would be non-weight bearing on the crutches, really trying to get onto the swelling management and trying to make sure that they're not just sitting at the accommodation for 3 days, not doing anything. And it's probably the worst thing you can do. So it's probably the part of the job that I enjoy the most, is giving people the information to help them make a good decision, but also what's going to work for them. I can think of one example actually quickly that's quite an interesting one. We had a guy come in. He was a commercial pilot, and he came in and he'd been skiing. I can't remember the exact mechanism, but it felt a bit of a pop. Had continued skiing, which a lot of the ACL injuries, a lot of them can do. And especially if you're a competent skier, you can. It's amazing what you can do with your body and in terms of giving yourself stability. So he kind of came in, he's asking all the questions. What was the effusion like? Was it straight away? Was it delayed the next day? Gives you an idea of some of the severity of the injury sometimes. And looking at his knee, he's got positive swipe tests, minimal pain, functioning really well. And I'd say the thing about seeing so many ACLs that you see in the ski fields is you're really good at your objective testing. Your Lockman's needs to be pretty spot on, and you try not to sit there for 10 minutes doing a Lockman's and potentially flipping at the end of an ACL tear over on itself and not helping the whole cause. But we would usually do the testing, and then pretty much I'd said to him, well, look, it feels to me like it could be your ACL. It can be difficult getting MRIs in Japan on short notice.
That was my next question, actually. How much access do you have to MRI?
Yeah, it can be difficult for a tourist, I'd say. And so we felt his knee, and I was like, mate, I'm very, very confident you've done your ACL. And he's like, oh, I just kind of don't believe you, because I'm skiing and it doesn't feel sore, and I'm going to keep skiing. And I was like, if you want to do this approach, and he was really, really against surgery. And I said, well, if you want to do this approach, and it might be suitable for you, but really, like, we shouldn't be weight bearing. We shouldn't be skiing. We've got to get you in these angles, and that's the way to go. And he said, like, look, I'm going to ski regardless of what you say, which was frustrating, but at the same time, you want to make sure that if someone's going to do it, they're well protected, and you can't handcuff people to the clinic and say, you're an adult, you make your own decision. Here's all the advice I can give you, and definitely not like sugarcoating it. And so we kind of compromised on, look, let's do a couple of days, get things kind of activated a bit, let's get your swelling down. We'll get you in the brace. If you decide to go into the cross bracing, like, look, we're already in that position, so you've kind of already got that first part. I might be wrong. You might get the scan. It's completely fine. But he ended up going to another ski resort, saw another of the physios, passed all these functional tests, and could hop around, could do all these things in this brace, and he ended up going back skiing, no issues, against the advice. And I'd say, like, look, if you're going to do this, you got to get this MRI sorted and make sure, and just see what's going on here. Went back, saw Dr. Cross, I'm trying to think of the grade that it was, but the sheath of his ACL was still intact. He'd ruptured, but he'd maintained a bit of that kind of framework. And he did a modified bracing protocol in the end. And being in contact months later, I just said like, oh, what was the updates with your 3 month and your 6 month? And he said, yeah, we're on the way to a full heal. So one of those ones, and I wouldn't recommend it. Probably had done everything possible to reduce his chances of healing his ACL. He had his knee aspirated twice, which they talk about, having the clotting and all that inflammatory soup and all those things happening for that bridge of healing to happen. He'd done all the things that you probably shouldn't do, and we kind of protected him from extension, and he's ended up with a full heal. So it's quite amazing, some of those. That's obviously a very unique, and I wouldn't say there's many people where we're saying it's a good idea to go back to on such a short notice. But he was back skiing within the week, and doing all the due diligence and giving all the informed information for him to make a decision, and then having all the kind of the process in line to make sure when he got back that he was well looked after. And yeah, he's had a really good outcome and has no issues to speak of yet. So Dr. Cross here was a good candidate. He went on and did a modified protocol, and was turned out pretty well so far.
All the ACLs that you have been seeing, or you did see over the last season you were there, are you typically giving them the advice of the major three options that you've got? And what percentage of those that came in do you think ended up doing the cross bracing protocol?
Yeah, I think it is still early days with that protocol, so there's some there's a lot of skepticism around it still. So I'd say the uptake wasn't, if I said 100%, it would it'd probably be less than 10% that I had in Nozawa. Keeping in mind that there's a bunch of people that aren't appropriate for it with the nature of their injury. So that rules
Exactly.
out
Yep.
a large chunk of them straight away.
A big thing with that though, that's dependent on the MRI.
Yes. Yep.
Once it's classified. So they're not going to know that until they have the MRI, whether that's in Australia or America or wherever it is.
Mm.
So then and there, when you're at Nozawa, you're giving them the information and telling them that these are the options, and then you're leaving it up to them to make the final decision, and then they get the MRI back when they're at home. Yeah.
Yeah, so depending on how long they're there for, you can get MRIs in Japan. Also, some of the things that kind of rule it out, tibial plateau fractures that are really
Yeah.
common in the ski fields, that kind of knocks out. There are a bunch of the ones that we knock out straight away.
But are you going, like, say for instance with that and like a bucket handle meniscal tear, because that's another contraindication, you're not going to know that until you get some form of imaging, yeah?
Yeah.
So yeah, you need to get that done, don't you, before you're making this decision?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we have X-ray in town. We
Oh,
have
right.
Inuyama
Cool.
CT, MRI as well. So you can get some of that imaging done. I guess the stance that we usually take with it, and what I take with it, is like, well, if you're going to do this cross bracing protocol, we can kind of account for it now, and then you've got to see if you're appropriate for it, because you might get back and we've got this going on, and that rules you out straight away. So it's more about saying, look, there's a few ways to traditionally manage these. It used to be surgical or conservative. And these are the pros and cons of those. There's this third option as well. If you want that third option, we've almost got to plan for it now, so
Yeah.
you're still appropriate by the time you get back. A lot of that's around timing as well. Getting an ACL and the two stumps of involuted, and you're not going to get a heel, helps kind of make that decision as well. So if they're, I'm here for a month and I heard it, 3 weeks ago, you're starting to get right on that, day 14 even is pushing it a fair bit. And even day 6, day 7, they can be involution. So it's making sure that, I guess, they're protected in that initial stage, And then if it lines up with the timing of not only getting back to Australia and having their MRIs, but also just making sure that it lines up with their lifestyles and things as well. For some people, weeks stuck at 90 degrees is just not feasible for them, which is completely fine. And we go into the other options, and I think it rules out a lot of people quite quickly in that regard. So I'd say, probably less than 10 that I was seeing, 10% that I was seeing. But having said that, Niseko has knees back to back to back to back, a lot of the day. So they probably have a different percentage with that as well. So you give people the options. They don't have to make a decision on the spot. You just say, well, if you want this kind of trajectory and you want to kind of try this, we've got a plan for it now. You might not be appropriate by the time you get back to Australia, but we need the scan to find out and see if that's if you're even appropriate in the first place.
And how many days should you wait after the injury, typically before you fly home to wherever you are from, Australia, America, Europe?
Yeah, so talking to Dr. Cross, that 4 or 5 days is you don't want to really be within that. It's an interesting one because people, after having it's quite an emotionally charged injury as well, I guess. People are walking around their knees giving way. There's a lot we can do for them to give them their stability back in terms of bracing and things like that. But they'll often just want to be getting back home, and then it's like, well, you really need to have a chat to the doctor and see if this is a good idea with that amount of swelling, and if you're going to be non-weight bearing, and your chance of clotting goes up a lot. So that tends to be something you have to have a pretty stern conversation with. Some people as well will take that on, and some people, if they choose to risk it, you've just got to make sure you're getting a Doppler when you get back as well. You don't want the last thing you want is a clot, and then it's traveling up. And fortunately, in all my years, haven't had a patient that's had one. I'd follow up with, all my ACLs, just to make sure to get the feedback that what I felt was correct, and two, just to make sure what their experience was like. And I think when I first started out, I just want to make sure that what I was feeling was right. There's no point in saying, oh, you've done your ACL, and then they go back and they haven't, and you're going on the belief, oh, that's what it feels like. Yeah, that's what a rupture feels like. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But yeah, not a huge uptake, I'd say, with the cross bracing just yet. But I'm sure as it gets more well known and things like that, considering the flying is to cycle back, the flying is quite an important aspect. But within 5 days is definitely pushing it. And if you're non-weight bearing, your chances go up as well. So you want to make sure that you're having a chat to the doc, and making sure you're not elevating your risk, really.
An interesting time in regards to the ACL management, isn't it? It's, as you said, it's controversial, but at the same time, like, I've seen several of them at our clinic and they've done really well. And it'd be interesting to see the long-term data, because obviously we don't have any really solid long-term data yet. And it's a watch this space type of protocol. So it'd be interesting to see where things go with that. Now, in regards to the pay, just one more question. You've been very generous with your time. In regards to payment, if you're an Aussie, you're in Japan and you do your knee, you go in to see you guys, do you just pay up front and then the travel insurance is covering it? If you do have travel insurance, how does it work?
Yeah, so there's probably a few different scenarios. So a lot of people will just pay up front, and then travel insurance will usually reimburse them. The Australian travel insurances are really they can be really easy to deal with. Some of the international ones require a little bit more, I guess, paperwork, or they'll want a doctor's a doctor's referral as well, saying they should be seeing physio or something like that. So some of the Southeast Asian countries and some of the Asian countries will require that. The Australian ones tend to be pretty good about it, but often the kind of patients will ring up and just say, "Oh, what am I kind of covered for?" And hopefully you would have checked all your snow coverage and where you're covered, on piste, off piste as well, and out of bounds is you're automatically not covered, but inbounds but off piste, some insurances they cover as well. So most people would pay and then get reimbursed back. There would be another group of people that if they're working over there can be like a direct billing. So if you're a ski instructor and you hurt yourself and you're going to be there for 4 more months, it can be set up like a direct billing, I guess, and that means that we kind of just like correspond with the insurance, and you're not necessarily paying out of pocket like that. But otherwise, people be paying privately or with the intention of claiming back on their travel insurance. And if that's the case, you've just got to make sure that you've got all the all your invoices and all the kind of letters that go along with it, and you've chatted to them about what they need, and then it's usually pretty smooth sailing with that stuff. There, I think as well, from December to March, April each year, there's an influx of claims that come from the ski field. So it's not like it's a big surprise for the travel insurances, but they're usually very accommodating, and particularly the Australian ones, which are, I mean, they're all majority underwritten by the same kind of parent company, but they can be really helpful in terms of getting people home. Upgrades with flights, or I've had people before that will get Clexane injections, met them at the airport, and a nurse brings them aside and has the injection, and it's and away they go with various kind of fractures and other injuries, and they can be really helpful. And it's, I was kind of saying before, it's a very emotionally um, draining experience being in a foreign country without not necessarily knowing the language. And it's a nice thing about explaining it to people and how it all works, and say, oh, we're going to do this, and this, and here's the information. And you hope that it's just a little less daunting than being in a foreign place with a pretty significant injury. It can be pretty overwhelming for a lot of people. So most people pay, and then they'll kind of put it in as a claim, and they usually chat to their travel insurances after they've done their injury and just find out what they actually need to do, so they're not running into any problems with the claim process.
Moral of the story is make sure you get travel insurance, and also you need to tick snow sports.
Yes, yes. Get travel insurance, because uh, there's some shocking stories about people that have gone into places where they shouldn't be, and very competent riders, and you get a lot of broken femurs and things like that, which require some pretty unique ways of getting them out of the resort, not necessarily by helicopter. And then all of a sudden you're getting a rod, and you're getting all these things done in Japan, and there's a medical emergency, and the bills add up, and so you want travel insurance.
Yeah.
It's not really
And you want
worth
the
the
top dog
risk.
travel insurance, in my opinion. Like Cover More is often something that's spooked online a lot, that they're great, but it just make sure you get the snow cover, because sometimes the general cover doesn't cover the snow stuff.
Yeah. And just making sure what you're covered for within the
Yeah.
snow coverage as well. Because, like I said, on piste, off piste, out
Yeah.
of bounds, side country, some are covering, back country, side country, everything. But you really need to check the T's and C's with it, and read the fine print with it as well. So there's a few that are really, really good. But generally they're pretty easy to work with.
Well, thanks, Nick, for your time. It's been a pleasure. It's been great to catch up, and you've been a wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much for coming on the Wild Physio podcast.
My pleasure. Always good to chat.
We'll have to do it again soon, and hopefully the following season you're back in as our, and I'm not coming in with with an ACL. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, under different circumstances, always better to see not as a patient. So let's keep it that way.
Indeed. This was his first podcast as well, everyone listening. He's absolutely nailed it. You're born to podcast, Nick.
I don't know about that, mate, but thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
No worries, my pleasure. And as usual, stay strong.